Chapter 19. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin. The power that had impelled Don Luis to battle and victory was so intense that it suffered, so to speak, no cheek. Disappointment, rage, humiliation, torture, were all swallowed up in an immediate desire for action and information, together with a longing to continue the chase. The rest was but an incident of no importance, which would soon be very simply explained. The petrified taxi driver was gazing wildly at the peasants coming from the distant farms, attracted by the sound of the aeroplane. Don Luis took him by the throat and put the barrel of his revolver to the man's temple. "Tell me what you know, or you're a dead man." And when the unhappy wretch began to stammer out entreaties. "It's no use moaning, no use hoping for assistance. Those people won't get here in time. So there's only one way of saving yourself, speak. Last night a gentleman came to Versailles from Paris in a taxi, left it and took yours, is that it?" "Yes." "The gentleman had a lady with him?" "Yes." "And he engaged you to take him to Nantes?" "Yes." "But he changed his mind on the way and told you to put him down?" "Yes." "Where?" "Before we got to Mans, in a little road on the right, with a sort of coach house, looking like a shed, 100 yards down it. They both got out there. And you went on?" "He paid me to." "How much?" 500 francs. "And there was another fare waiting at Nantes that I was to pick up and bring back to Paris for 1,000 francs more. Do you believe in that other fare?" "No. I think he wanted to put people off the scent by sending them after me to Nantes while he branched off. Still, I had my money. And, when you left them, weren't you curious to see what happened?" "No." "Take care. A movement of my finger and I blow out your brains." "Speak." "Well, yes, then. I went back on foot, behind a bank covered with trees. The man had opened the coach house and was starting a small limousine car. The lady did not want to get in. They argued pretty fiercely. He threatened and begged by turns. But I could not hear what they said. She seemed very tired. He gave her a glass of water, which he drew from a tap in the wall. Then she consented. He closed the door on her and took his seat at the wheel. "A glass of water," cried Don Luis. "Are you sure he put nothing else into the glass?" The driver seemed surprised at the question and then answered. "Yes, I think he did. He took something from his pocket." "Without the lady's knowledge?" "Yes, she didn't see." Don Luis mastered his horror. After all, it was impossible that the villain had poisoned Florence in that way, at that place, without anything to warrant so great a hurry. No, it was more likely that he had employed a narcotic, a drug of some sort which would dull Florence's brain and make her incapable of noticing by what new roads and through what towns he was taking her. And then, he repeated, she decided to step in. "Yes, and he shut the door and got into the driver's seat. I went away then. Before knowing which direction they took." "Yes." "Did you suspect on the way that they thought that they were being followed?" "Certainly." "He did nothing but put his head out of the window." "Did the lady cry out at all?" "No." "Would you know him again if you saw him?" "No, I'm sure I shouldn't. At Versailles it was dark. And this morning I was too far away. Besides, it's curious, but the first time he struck me as very tall, and this morning, on the contrary, he looked quite a short man, as though bent in two. I can't understand it at all." Don Luis reflected. It seemed to him that he had asked all the necessary questions. Moreover, a gig drawn by a quick-trotting horse was approaching the crossroads. There were 2 others behind it. And the groups of peasants were now quite near. He must finish the business. He said to the chauffeur. "I can see by your face that you intend to talk about me. Don't do that, my man, it would be foolish of you. Here's 1,000 franc note for you. Only, if you blab, I'll make you repent it." That's all I have to say to you. He turned to Devan, whose machine was beginning to block the traffic, and asked. Can we start? Whenever you like. Where are we going? Paying no attention to the movements of the people coming from every side, Don Luis unfolded his map of France and spread it out before him. He experienced a few seconds of anxiety at seeing the complicated tangle of roads and picturing the infinite number of places to which the villain might carry Florence. But he pulled himself together. He did not allow himself to hesitate. He refused even to reflect. He was determined to find out, and to find out everything, at once, without clues, without useless consideration, simply by the marvelous intuition which invariably guided him at any crisis in his life. And his self-respect also required that he should give Devan his answer without delay, and that the disappearance of those whom he was pursuing should not seem to embarrass him. With his eyes glued to the map, he placed one finger on Paris and another on Le Mans and, even before he had asked himself why the scoundrel had chosen that Paris-Le Mans-Angers route, he knew the answer to the question. The name of a town had struck him and made the truth appear like a flash of lightning, Alassa. Then and there, by the light of his memory, he penetrated the mystery. He repeated. Where are we going? Back again, bearing to the left. Any particular place? Alassa. All right, said Devan. Lend a hand, some of you. I can make an easy start from that field just there. Don Luis and a few others helped him, and the preparations were soon made. Devan tested his engine. Everything was in perfect order. At that moment a powerful racing car, with a siren yelling like a vicious animal, came tearing along the Angers road and promptly stopped. 3 men got out and rushed up to the driver of the yellow taxicab. Don Luis recognized them. They were Weber, the deputy chief, and the men who had taken him to the lockup the night before, sent by the prefect of police to follow up the scoundrel's tracks. They had a brief interchange of words with the cab driver, which seemed to put them out, and they kept on gesticulating and plying him with fresh questions while looking at their watches and consulting their road maps. Don Luis went up to them. He was unrecognizable, with his head wrapped in his aviation cap and his face concealed by his goggles. Changing his voice. The birds have flown, Mr. Deputy Chief, he said. Weber looked at him in utter amazement. Don Luis grinned. Yes, flown. Our friend from the Isle St. Louis is an artful dodger, you know. My lord's in his 3rd motor. After the yellow car of which you heard at Versailles last night, he took another at Le Mans, destination unknown. The deputy chief opened his eyes in amazement. Who was this person who was mentioning facts that had been telephoned to police headquarters only at 2 o'clock that morning? He gasped. But who are you, monsieur? What? Don't you know me? What's the good of making appointments with people? You strain every nerve to be punctual, and then they ask you who you are. Come, Weber, confess that you're doing it to annoy me. Must you gaze on my features in broad daylight? Here goes. He raised his mask. Arsène Lupin, spluttered the detective. At your service, young fellow, on foot, in the saddle, and in mid-air. That's where I'm going now. Goodbye. And so great was Weber's astonishment at seeing Arsène Lupin, whom he had taken to the lockup 12 hours before, standing in front of him, free, at 240 miles from Paris, that Don Luis, as he went back to Devan, thought. What a crusher. I've knocked him out in 1 round. There's no hurry. The referee will count 10 at least 3 times before Weber can say mother. Devan was ready. Don Luis climbed into the monoplane. The peasants pushed at the wheels. The machine started. North-northeast, Don Luis ordered. 90 miles an hour. 10,000 francs. We've the wind against us, said Devan. 5,000 francs extra for the wind, shouted Don Luis. He admitted no obstacle in his haste to reach Dimigny. He now understood the whole thing and, harking back to the very beginning. He was surprised that his mind had never perceived the connection between the two skeletons hanging in the barn and the series of crimes resulting from the Mornington inheritance. Stranger still, how was it that the almost certain murder of Langrenalt, Hippolyte Fauville's old friend, had not afforded him all the clues which it contained? The crux of the sinister plot lay in that. Who could have intercepted, on Fauville's behalf, the letters of accusation which Fauville was supposed to write to his old friend Langrenalt, except someone in the village or someone who had lived in the village? And now everything was clear. It was the nameless scoundrel who had started his career of crime by killing old Langrenalt and then the de Desislemer couple. The method was the same as later on, it was not direct murder, but anonymous murder, murder by suggestion. Like Mornington the American, like Fauville the engineer, like Marie, like Gaston Sauverand, old Langrenalt had been craftily done away with and the de Desislemer couple driven to commit suicide in the barn. It was from there that the tiger had come to Paris, where later he was to find Fauville and Cosmo Mornington and plot the tragic affair of the inheritance. And it was there that he was now returning. There was no doubt about that. To begin with, the fact that he had administered a narcotic to Florence constituted an indisputable proof. Was he not obliged to put Florence to sleep in order to prevent her from recognizing the landscape at Alassa and Demigny, or the old castle, which she had explored with Gaston Sauverand? On the other hand, the Le Mans Agence route, which had been taken to put the police on a false track, meant only an extra hour or two, at most, for anyone motoring to Alassa. Lastly, that coach house near a big town, that limousine waiting, ready charged with petrol, showed that the villain, when he intended to visit his retreat, took the precaution of stopping at Le Mans, in order to go from there, in his limousine, to Langrenalt's deserted estate. He would therefore reach his lair at 10 o'clock that morning. And he would arrive there with Florence Levasseur dead asleep. The question forced itself upon him, the terrible persistent question, what did he mean to do with Florence Levasseur? Faster! Faster! Cried Don Luis. Now that he knew the scoundrel's haunt, the man's scheme became hideously evident to him. Feeling himself hunted down, lost, an object of hatred and terror to Florence, whose eyes were now open to the true state of things, what plan could he have in mind except his invariable plan of murder? Faster! Cried Don Luis. We're making no headway. Go faster, can't you? Florence murdered. Perhaps the crime was not yet accomplished. No, it could not be. Killing takes time. It is preceded by words, by the offer of a bargain, by threats, by entreaties, by a wholly unspeakable scene. But the thing was being prepared, Florence was going to die. Florence was going to die by the hand of the brute who loved her. For he loved her, Don Luis had an intuition of that monstrous love, and he was bound to believe that such a love could only end in torture and bloodshed. Sable. Ciel le Guillaume. The earth sped beneath them. The trees and houses glided by like shadows. And then Alassa. It was hardly more than 1:45 when they landed in a meadow between the town and Demigny. Don Luis made inquiries. A number of motor cars had passed along the road to Demigny, including a small limousine driven by a gentleman who had turned down a crossroad. And this crossroad led to the woods at the back of Langrenalt's estate, the old castle. Don Luis's conviction was so firm that, after taking leave of Devan, he helped him to start on his homeward flight. He had no further need of him. He needed nobody. The final duel was at hand. He ran along, guided by the tracks of the tires in the dust, and followed the crossroad. To his great surprise, this road went nowhere near the wall behind the barn from which he had jumped a few weeks before. After clearing the woods, Don Luis came out into a large untilled space where the road turned back toward the estate and ended at an old two-winged gate protected with iron sheets and bars. The limousine had gone in that way. And I must get in this way, too, thought Don Luis. I must get in at all costs and immediately, without wasting time in looking for an opening or a handy tree. Now the wall was 13 feet high at this spot. Don Luis got in. How he managed it, by what superhuman effort, he himself could not have said after he had done it. Somehow or other, by hanging on to invisible projections, by digging a knife which he had borrowed from Devan into the interstices between the stones, he managed it. And when he was on the other side he discovered the tracks of the tires running to the left, toward a part of the grounds which he did not know. More undulating than the other and broken up with little hills and ruined buildings covered with thick curtains of ivy. Deserted though the rest of the park was, this portion seemed much more uncivilized, in spite of the ragged remains of box and laurel hedges that stood here and there amidst the nettles and brambles, and the luxuriant swarm of tall wildflowers. Valerian, mullein, hemlock, foxglove, and angelica. Suddenly, on turning the corner of an old hedge of clipped yews, Don Luis saw the limousine, which had been left, or, rather, hidden there in a hollow. The door was open. The disorder of the inside of the car, the rug hanging over the footboard, a broken window, a cushion on the floor, all bore witness to a struggle. The scoundrel had no doubt taken advantage of the fact that Florence was asleep to tie her up. And on arriving, when he tried to take her out of the car, Florence must have clutched at everything that offered. Don Luis at once verified the correctness of his theory. As he went along the very narrow, grass-grown path that led up the slope, he saw that the grass was uniformly pressed down. Oh, the villain, he thought. The villain. He doesn't carry his victim, he drags her. If he had listened only to his instinct, he would have rushed to Florence's rescue. But his profound sense of what to do and what to avoid saved him from committing any such imprudence. At the first alarm, at the least sound, the tiger would have throttled his prey. To escape this hideous catastrophe, Don Luis must take him by surprise and then and there deprive him of his power of action. He controlled himself, therefore, and slowly and cautiously mounted the incline. The path ran upward between heaps of stones and fallen buildings, and among clumps of shrubs overtopped by beeches and oaks. The place was evidently the site of the old feudal castle which had given the estate its name, and it was here, near the top, that the scoundrel had selected one of his retreats. The trail continued over the trampled herbage. And Don Luis even caught sight of something shining on the ground, in a tuft of grass. It was a ring, a tiny and very simple ring, consisting of a gold circlet and two small pearls, which he had often noticed on Florence's finger. And the fact that caught his attention was that a blade of grass passed and repassed and passed a third time through the inside of the ring, like a ribbon that had been rolled round it deliberately. "It's a clear signal," said Perenna to himself. "The villain probably stopped here to rest, and Florence, bound up, but with her fingers free, was able to leave this evidence of her passage." So the girl still hoped. She expected assistance. And Don Luis reflected with emotion that it was perhaps to him that this last desperate appeal was addressed. 50 steps farther, and this detail pointed to the rather curious fatigue experienced by the scoundrel, there was a second halt and a second clue, a flower, a field sage, which the poor little hand had picked and plucked of its petals. Next came the print of the 5 fingers dug into the ground, and next a cross drawn with a pebble. And in this way he was able to follow, minute by minute, all the successive stages of the horrible journey. The last stopping place was near. The climb became steeper and rougher. The fallen stones occasioned more frequent obstacles. On the right the Gothic arches, the remains of a chapel, stood out against the blue sky. On the left was a strip of wall with a mantelpiece still clinging to it. 20 steps farther Don Luis stopped. He seemed to hear something. He listened. He was not mistaken. The sound was repeated, and it was the sound of laughter. But such an awful laugh. A strident laugh, evil as the laughter of a devil, and so shrill. It was more like the laugh of a woman, of a madwoman. Again silence. Then another noise, the noise of an implement striking the ground, then silence again. And this was happening at a distance which Don Luis estimated at 100 yards. The path ended in 3 steps cut in the earth. At the top was a fairly large plateau, also encumbered with rubbish and ruins. In the center, opposite Don Luis, stood a screen of immense laurels planted in a semicircle. The marks of trodden grass led up to it. Don Luis was a little surprised, for the screen presented an impenetrable outline. He walked on and found that there had once been a cutting, and that the branches had ended by meeting again. They were easy to push aside, and it was through here that the scoundrel must have passed. To all appearances he was there now, at the end of his journey, not far away, occupied in some sinister task. Indeed, the air was rent by a chuckle, so close by that Don Luis gave a start and felt as if the scoundrel were laughing beforehand at his intervention. He remembered the letter with the words written in red ink. "There's still time, Lupin. Retire from the contest. If not, it means your death, too. When you think that your object is attained, when your hand is raised against me and you utter words of triumph, at the same moment the ground will open beneath your feet. The place of your death is chosen. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin." The whole letter passed through his brain, with its formidable threat. And he felt a shiver of fear. But no fear could stay the man that he was. He had already taken hold of the branches with his hands and was clearing a way for himself. He stopped. A last bulwark of leaves hid him from sight. He pulled some of them aside at the level of his eyes. And he saw. First of all, he saw Florence, alone at this moment, lying on the ground, bound, at 30 yards in front of him, and he at once perceived, to his intense delight, from certain movements of her head that she was still alive. He had come in time. Florence was not dead. She would not die. That was a certainty against which nothing could prevail. Florence would not die. Then he examined the things around. To the right and left of where he stood the screen of laurels curved and embraced a sort of arena in which, among yews that had once been clipped into cones, lay capitals, columns, broken pieces of arches and vaults. Obviously placed there to adorn the formal garden that had been laid out on the ruins of the ancient dungeon keep. In the middle was a small circular space reached by two narrow paths, one of which presented the same traces of trodden grass and was a continuation of that by which Don Luis had come, while the other intersected the first at right angles and joined the two ends of the screen of shrubs. Opposite was a confused heap of broken stones and natural rocks, cemented with clay, bound together by the roots of gnarled trees, the whole forming at the back of the picture a small, shallow grotto, full of crevices that admitted the light. The floor, which Don Luis could easily distinguish, consisted of 3 or 4 flagstones. Florence Levasseur lay inside this grotto, bound hand and foot, looking like the victim of some mysterious sacrifice about to be performed on the altar of the grotto. In the amphitheater of this old garden closed by the wall of tall laurels and overlooked by a pile of ancestral ruins. In spite of the distance, Don Luis was able to make out every detail of her pale face. Though convulsed with anguish, it still retained a certain serenity, an expression of waiting and even of expectancy, as if Florence, believing, until the last moment, in the possibility of a miracle, had not yet relinquished all hope of life. Nevertheless, though she was not gagged, she did not call for help. Perhaps she thought that it was useless, and that the road which she had strewn with the marks of her passing was more likely to bring assistance to her side than cries, which the villain would soon have stifled. Strange to say, it seemed to Don Luis as if the girl's eyes were obstinately fixed on the very spot where he was hiding. Possibly she suspected his presence. Possibly she foresaw his help. Suddenly Don Luis clutched one of his revolvers and half raised his arm, ready to take aim. The sacrificer, the butcher, had just appeared, not far from the altar on which the victim lay. He came from between two rocks, of which a bush marked the intervening space, which apparently afforded but a very low outlet, for he still walked as though bent double, with his head bowed and his long arms swinging so low as to touch the ground. He went to the grotto and gave his horrible chuckle. "You're still there, I see," he said. "No sign of the rescuer? Perseus is a little late, I fear. He'd better hurry." The tone of his voice was so shrill that Don Luis heard every word, and so odd, so unhuman, that it gave him a feeling of physical discomfort. He gripped his revolver tightly, prepared to shoot at the first suspicious movement. "He'd better hurry," repeated the scoundrel, with a laugh. "If not, all will be over in 5 minutes. You see that I'm a man of method, Florence, my darling." He picked up something from the ground. It was a stick shaped like a crutch. He put it under his left arm and, still bent in two, began to walk like a man who has not the strength to stand erect. Then suddenly, and with no apparent cause to explain his change of attitude, he drew himself up and used his crutch as he would a cane. He then walked round the outside of the grotto, making a careful inspection, the meaning of which escaped Don Luis for the time. He was of a good height in this position. And Don Luis easily understood why the driver of the yellow taxi, who had seen him under two such different aspects, was unable to say whether he was very tall or very short. But his legs, slack and unsteady, gave way beneath him, as if any prolonged exertion were beyond his power. He relapsed into his first attitude. The man was a cripple, smitten with some disease that affected his powers of locomotion. He was excessively thin. Don Luis also saw his pallid face, his cavernous cheeks, his hollow temples, his skin the color of parchment, the face of a sufferer from consumption, a bloodless face. When he had finished his inspection, he came up to Florence and said, "Though you've been very good, baby, and haven't screamed so far. We'd better take our precautions and remove any possibility of a surprise by giving you a nice little gag to wear, don't you think?" He stooped over her and wound a large handkerchief round the lower part of her face. Then, bending still farther down, he began to speak to her in a very low voice, talking almost into her ear. But wild bursts of laughter, horrible to hear, interrupted this whispering. Feeling the imminence of the danger, dreading some movement on the wretch's part, a sudden murderous attack, the prompt prick of a poisoned needle, Don Luis had leveled his revolver and, confident of his skill, waited events. What was happening over there? What were the words spoken? What infamous bargain was the villain proposing to Florence? At what shameful price could she obtain her release? The cripple stepped back angrily, shouting in furious accents. "But don't you understand that you are done for? Now that I have nothing more to fear, now that you have been silly enough to come with me and place yourself in my power, what hope have you left? To move me, perhaps, is that it? Because I'm burning with passion, you imagine? Oh, you never made a greater mistake, my pet. I don't care a fig if you do die. Once dead, you cease to count. What else? Perhaps you consider that, being crippled, I shall not have the strength to kill you. But there's no question of my killing you, Florence. Have you ever known me kill people? Never. I'm much too big a coward, I should be frightened, I should shake all over. No, no, Florence, I shan't touch you, and yet. Here, look what's going to happen, see for yourself. I tell you the things managed in my own style. And, whatever you do, don't be afraid. It's only a preliminary warning." He had moved away and, helping himself with his hands, holding on to the branches of a tree, he climbed up the first layers of rock that formed the grotto on the right. Here he knelt down. There was a small pickaxe lying beside him. He took it and gave 3 blows to the nearest heap of stones. They came tumbling down in front of the grotto. Don Luis sprang from his hiding place with a roar of terror. He had suddenly realized the position, the grotto, the accumulation of boulders, the piles of granite, everything was so placed that its equilibrium could be shattered at any moment, and that Florence ran the risk of being buried under the rubbish. It was not a question, therefore, of slaying the villain, but of saving Florence on the spot. He was halfway across in 2 or 3 seconds. But here, in one of those mental flashes which are even quicker than the maddest rush, he became aware that the tracks of trampled grass did not cross the central circus and that the scoundrel had gone round it. Why? That was one of the questions which instinct, ever suspicious, puts, but which reason has not the time to answer. Don Luis went straight ahead. And he had no sooner set foot on the place than the catastrophe occurred. It all happened with incredible suddenness, as though he had tried to walk on space and found himself hurled into it. The ground gave way beneath him. The clods of grass separated, and he fell. He fell down a hole which was none other than the mouth of a well 4 feet wide at most, the curb of which had been cut down level with the ground. Only this was what took place: as he was running very fast, his impetus flung him against the opposite wall in such a way that his forearms lay on the outer ledge and his hands were able to clutch at the roots of plants. So great was his strength that he might just have been able to drag himself up by his wrists. But responding to the attack, the scoundrel had at once hurried to meet his assailant and was now standing at 10 paces from Don Luis, threatening him with his revolver. "Don't move," he cried, "or I'll smash you." Don Luis was thus reduced to helplessness, at the risk of receiving the enemy's fire. Their eyes met for a few seconds. The cripples were burning with fever, like the eyes of a sick man. Crawling along, watching Don Luis's slightest movement, he came and squatted beside the well. The revolver was leveled in his outstretched hand. And his infernal chuckle rang out again. "Lupin! Lupin! That's done it! Lupin's dive! What a mug you must be! I warned you, you know, warned you in blood-red ink. Remember my words, the place of your death is chosen. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin. And here you are. So you're not in prison. You warded off that stroke, you rogue, you. Fortunately, I foresaw events and took my precautions. What do you say to it? What do you think of my little scheme? I said to myself, all the police will come rushing at my heels. But there's only one who's capable of catching me, and that's Lupin. So we'll show him the way, we'll lead him on the leash all along a little path scraped clean by the victim's body. And then a few landmarks, scattered here and there. First, the fair damsel's ring, with a blade of grass twisted round it, farther on a flower without its petals, farther on the marks of 5 fingers in the ground, next, the sign of the cross. No mistaking them, was there? Once you thought me fool enough to give Florence time to play hop-o'-my-thumb's game, it was bound to lead you straight to the mouth of the well, to the clods of turf which I dabbed across it, last month, in anticipation of this windfall. Remember, the snare is laid. And a snare after my own style, Lupin, one of the best. Oh, I love getting rid of people with their kind assistance. We work together like friends and partners. You've caught the notion, haven't you? I don't do my own job. The others do it for me, hanging themselves or giving themselves careless injections, unless they prefer the mouth of a well, as you seem to do, Lupin. My poor old chap, what a sticky mess you're in. I never saw such a face, never, on my word. Florence, do look at the expression on your swain's mobile features. He broke off, seized with a fit of laughter that shook his outstretched arm, imparted the most savage look to his face, and set his legs jerking under his body like the legs of a dancing doll. His enemy was growing weaker before his eyes. Don Luis's fingers, which had first gripped the roots of the grass, were now vainly clutching the stones of the wall. And his shoulders were sinking lower and lower into the well. "We've done it," spluttered the villain, in the midst of his convulsions of merriment. Lord, how good it is to laugh! Especially when one so seldom does. Yes, I'm a wet blanket, I am, a first-rate man at a funeral. You've never seen me laugh, Florence, have you? But this time it's really too amusing. Lupin in his hole and Florence in her grotto, one dancing a jig above the abyss and the other at her last gasp under her mountain. What a sight! Come, Lupin, don't tire yourself. What's the use of those grimaces? You're not afraid of eternity, are you? A good man like you, the Don Quixote of modern times. Come, let yourself go. There's not even any water in the well to splash about in. No, it's just a nice little slide into infinity. You can't so much as hear the sound of a pebble when you drop it in, and just now I threw a piece of lighted paper down and lost sight of it in the dark. Brr. It sent a cold shiver down my back. Come, be a man. It'll only take a moment, and you've been through worse than that. Good, you nearly did it then. You're making up your mind to it. I say, Lupin. Lupin. Aren't you going to say goodbye? Not a smile, not a word of thanks. Au revoir, Lupin, au revoir. He ceased. He watched for the appalling end which he had so cleverly prepared and of which all the incidents were following close on one another in accordance with his inflexible will. It did not take long. The shoulders had gone down, the chin, and then the mouth convulsed with the death grin, and then the eyes, drunk with terror, and then the forehead and the hair, the whole head, in short, had disappeared. The cripple sat gazing wildly, as though in ecstasy, motionless, with an expression of fierce delight, and without a word that could trouble the silence and interrupt his hatred. At the edge of the abyss nothing remained but the hands, the obstinate, stubborn, desperate, heroic hands, the poor, helpless hands which alone still lived, and which, gradually, retreating toward death, yielded and fell back and let go. The hands had slipped. For a moment the fingers held on like claws. So natural was the effort which they made that it looked as if they did not even yet despair, unaided, of resuscitating and bringing back to the light of day the corpse already entombed in the darkness. And then they in their turn gave way. And then, suddenly, there was nothing more to be seen and nothing more to be heard. The cripple started to his feet, as though released by a spring, and yelled with delight. Oof! That's done it. Lupin in the bottomless pit. One more adventure finished. Oof! Turning in Florence's direction, he once more danced his dance of death. He raised himself to his full height and then suddenly crouched down again, throwing about his legs like the grotesque, ragged limbs of a scarecrow. And he sang and whistled and belched forth insults and hideous blasphemies. Then he came back to the yawning mouth of the well and, standing some way off, as if still afraid to come nearer, he spat into it 3 times. Nor was this enough for his hatred. There were some broken pieces of statuary on the ground. He took a carved head, rolled it along the grass, and sent it crashing down the well. A little farther away was a stack of old, rusty cannon balls. These also he rolled to the edge and pushed in. 5, 10, 15 cannon balls went scooting down, one after the other, banging against the walls with a loud and sinister noise which the echo swelled into the angry roar of distant thunder. There, take that, Lupin. I'm sick of you, you dirty cad. That's for the spokes you put in my wheel, over that damned inheritance. Here, take this, too. And this. And this. Here's a chocolate for you in case you're hungry. Do you want another? Here you are, old chap. Catch. He staggered, seized with a sort of giddiness, and had to squat on his haunches. He was utterly spent. However, obeying a last convulsion, he still found the strength to kneel down by the well, and leaning over the darkness, he stammered, breathlessly. Hi. I say. Corpse. Don't go knocking at the gate of hell at once. The little girl's joining you in 20 minutes. Yes, that's it, at 4 o'clock. You know I'm a punctual man and keep my appointments to the minute. She'll be with you at 4 o'clock exactly. By the way, I was almost forgetting, the inheritance, you know, Mornington's 100 millions, well, that's mine. Why, of course. You can't doubt that I took all my precautions. Florence will explain everything presently. It's very well thought out, you'll see, you'll see. He could not get out another word. The last syllables sounded more like hiccups. The sweat poured from his hair and his forehead, and he sank to the ground, moaning like a dying man tortured by the last throes of death. He remained like that for some minutes, with his head in his hands, shivering all over his body. He appeared to be suffering everywhere, in each anguished muscle, in each sick nerve. Then, under the influence of a thought that seemed to make him act unconsciously, one of his hands crept spasmodically down his side, and, groping, uttering hoarse cries of pain, he managed to take from his pocket and put to his lips a phial out of which he greedily drank 2 or 3 mouthfuls. He at once revived, as though he had swallowed warmth and strength. His eyes grew calmer, his mouth shaped itself into a horrible smile. He turned to Florence and said, "Don't flatter yourself, pretty one. I'm not gone yet, and I've plenty of time to attend to you. And then, after that, there'll be no more worries, no more of that scheming and fighting that wears one out. A nice, quiet, uneventful life for me. With 100 millions one can afford to take life easy, little girl. Come on, I'm feeling much better." Chapter 20. Florence's Secret. It was time for the second act of the tragedy. Don Luis Perenna's death was to be followed by that of Florence. Like some monstrous butcher, the cripple passed from one to the other with no more compassion than if he were dealing with the oxen in a slaughterhouse. Still weak in his limbs, he dragged himself to where the girl lay, took a cigarette from a gunmetal case, and, with a final touch of cruelty, said, "When this cigarette is quite burnt out, Florence, it will be your turn. Keep your eyes on it. It represents the last minutes of your life reduced to ashes. Keep your eyes on it, Florence, and think. I want you to understand this: all the owners of the estate, and old Langernault in particular, have always considered that the heap of rocks and stones overhanging your head was bound to fall to pieces sooner or later. And I myself, for years, with untiring patience, believing in a favorable opportunity, have amused myself by making it crumble away still more, by undermining it with the rain water, in short, by working at it in such a way that, upon my word, I can't make out how the thing keeps standing at all. Or, rather, I do understand. The few strokes with the pickaxe which I gave it just now were merely intended for a warning. But I have only to give one more stroke in the right place, and knock out a little brick wedged in between 2 lumps of stone, for the whole thing to tumble to the ground like a house of cards. A little brick, Florence," he chuckled, "a tiny little brick which chance placed there, between 2 blocks of stone, and has kept in position until now. Out comes the brick, down come the blocks, and there's your catastrophe." He took breath and continued. "After that? After that, Florence, either the smash will take place in such a way that your body will not even be in sight, if anyone should dream of coming here to look for you, or else it will be partly visible. In which case I shall at once cut and destroy the cords with which you are tied. What will the law think then? Simply that Florence Levasseur, a fugitive from justice, hid herself in a grotto which fell upon her and crushed her. That's all. A few prayers for the rash creature's soul, and not another word. As for me, when my work is done and my sweetheart dead, I shall pack my traps, carefully remove all the traces of my coming, smooth every inch of the trampled grass, jump into my motor car, sham death for a little while. And then put in a sensational claim for the 100 millions. He gave a little chuckle, took 2 or 3 puffs at his cigarette, and added, calmly, "I shall claim the 100 millions and I shall get them. That's the prettiest part of it. I shall claim them because I'm entitled to them. And I explained to you just now before Master Lupin came interfering, how, from the moment that you were dead, I had the most undeniable legal right to them. And I shall get them, because it is physically impossible to bring up the least sort of proof against me." He moved closer. "There's not a charge that can hurt me. Suspicions, yes, moral presumptions, clues, anything you like, but not a scrap of material evidence. Nobody knows me. One person has seen me as a tall man, another as a short man. My very name is unknown. All my murders have been committed anonymously. All my murders are more like suicides, or can be explained as suicides. I tell you the law is powerless. With Lupin dead, and Florence Levasseur dead, there's no one to bear witness against me. Even if they arrested me, they would have to discharge me in the end for lack of evidence. I shall be branded, execrated, hated, and cursed, my name will stink in people's nostrils, as if I were the greatest of malefactors. But I shall possess the 100 millions, and with that, pretty one, I shall possess the friendship of all decent men. I tell you again, with Lupin and you gone, it's all over. There's nothing left, nothing but some papers and a few little things which I have been weak enough to keep until now, in this pocketbook here, and which would be enough and more than enough to cost me my head. If I did not intend to burn them in a few minutes and send the ashes to the bottom of the well. So you see, Florence, all my measures are taken. You need not hope for compassion from me, nor for help from anywhere else, since no one knows where I have brought you, and Arsène Lupin is no longer alive. Under these conditions, Florence, make your choice. The ending is in your own hands, either you die, absolutely and irrevocably, or you accept my love. There was a moment of silence, then. Answer me yes or no. A movement of your head will decide your fate. If it's no, you die. If it's yes, I shall release you. We will go from here and, later, when your innocence is proved, and I'll see to that, you shall become my wife. Is the answer yes, Florence? He put the question to her with real anxiety and with a restrained passion that set his voice trembling. His knees dragged over the flagstones. He begged and threatened, hungering to be entreated and, at the same time, almost eager for a refusal, so great was his natural murderous impulse. Is it yes, Florence? A nod, the least little nod, and I shall believe you implicitly, for you never lie and your promise is sacred. Is it yes, Florence? Oh, Florence, answer me. It is madness to hesitate. Your life depends on a fresh outburst of my anger. Answer me. Here, look, my cigarette is out. I'm throwing it away, Florence. A sign of your head, is the answer yes or no? He bent over her and shook her by the shoulders, as if to force her to make the sign which he asked for. But suddenly seized with a sort of frenzy, he rose to his feet and exclaimed. She's crying. She's crying. She dares to weep. But, wretched girl, do you think that I don't know what you're crying for? I know your secret, pretty one, and I know that your tears do not come from any fear of dying. You. Why, you fear nothing. No, it's something else. Shall I tell you your secret? Oh, I can't, though the words scorch my lips. Oh, cursed woman, you've brought it on yourself. You yourself want to die, Florence, as you're crying, you yourself want to die. While he was speaking he hastened to get to work and prepare the horrible tragedy. The leather pocketbook which he had mentioned as containing the papers was lying on the ground, he put it in his pocket. Then, still trembling, he pulled off his jacket and threw it on the nearest bush. Next, he took up the pickaxe and climbed the lower stones, stamping with rage and shouting. It's you who have asked to die, Florence. Nothing can prevent it now. I can't even see your head, if you make a sign. It's too late. You asked for it and you've got it. Ah, you're crying. You dare to cry. What madness! He was standing almost above the grotto, on the right. His anger made him draw himself to his full height. He looked horrible, hideous, atrocious. His eyes filled with blood as he inserted the bar of the pickaxe between the two blocks of granite, at the spot where the brick was wedged in. Then, standing on one side, in a place of safety, he struck the brick, struck it again. At the third stroke the brick flew out. What happened was so sudden, the pyramid of stones and rubbish came crashing with such violence into the hollow of the grotto and in front of the grotto, that the cripple himself, in spite of his precautions, was dragged down by the avalanche and thrown upon the grass. It was not a serious fall, however, and he picked himself up at once, stammering. Florence. Florence. Though he had so carefully prepared the catastrophe, and brought it about with such determination, its result seemed suddenly to stagger him. He hunted for the girl with terrified eyes. He stooped down and crawled round the chaos shrouded in clouds of dust. He looked through the interstices. He saw nothing. Florence was buried under the ruins, dead, invisible, as he had anticipated. Dead, he said, with staring eyes and a look of stupor on his face. Dead. Florence is dead. Once again he lapsed into a state of absolute prostration, which gradually slackened his legs, brought him to the ground and paralyzed him. His two efforts, following so close upon each other and ending in disasters of which he had been the immediate witness, seemed to have robbed him of all his remaining energy. With no hatred in him, since Arsène Lupin no longer lived, with no love, since Florence was no more, he looked like a man who has lost his last motive for existence. Twice his lips uttered the name of Florence. Was he regretting his friend? Having reached the last of that appalling series of crimes, was he imagining the several stages, each marked with a corpse? Was something like a conscience making itself felt deep down in that brute? Or was it not rather the sort of physical torpor that numbs the sated beast of prey, glutted with flesh, drunk with blood, a torpor that is almost voluptuousness? Nevertheless, he once more repeated Florence's name, and tears rolled down his cheeks. He lay long in this condition, gloomy and motionless. And when, after again taking a few sips of his medicine, he went back to his work, he did so mechanically, with none of that gaiety which had made him hop on his legs and set about his murder as though he were going to a pleasure party. He began by returning to the bush from which Lupin had seen him emerge. Behind this bush, between two trees, was a shelter containing tools and arms, spades, rakes, guns, and rolls of wire and rope. Making several journeys, he carried them to the well, intending to throw them down it before he went away. He next examined every particle of the little mound up which he had climbed, in order to make sure that he was not leaving the least trace of his passage. He made a similar examination of those parts of the lawn on which he had stepped, except the path leading to the well, the inspection of which he kept for the last. He brushed up the trodden grass and carefully smoothed the trampled earth. He was obviously anxious and seemed to be thinking of other things, while at the same time mechanically doing those things which a murderer knows by force of habit that it is wise to do. One little incident seemed to wake him up. A wounded swallow fell to the ground close by where he stood. He stooped, caught it, and crushed it in his hands, kneading it like a scrap of crumpled paper. And his eyes shone with a savage delight as he gazed at the blood that trickled from the poor bird and reddened his hands. But, when he flung the shapeless little body into a furze bush, he saw on the spikes in the bush a hare, a long, fair hare. And all his depression returned at the memory of Florence. He knelt in front of the ruined grotto. Then, breaking 2 sticks of wood, he placed the pieces in the form of a cross under one of the stones. As he was bending over, a little looking-glass slipped from his waistcoat pocket and, striking a pebble, broke. This sign of ill luck made a great impression on him. He cast a suspicious look around him and, shivering with nervousness, as though he felt threatened by the invisible powers, he muttered. I'm afraid. Let's go away." His watch now marked 4:30. He took his jacket from the shrub on which he had hung it, slipped his arms into the sleeves, and put his hand in the right-hand outside pocket, where he had placed the pocketbook containing his papers. "Hello," he said, in great surprise. "I was sure I had." He felt in the left outside pocket, then in the handkerchief pocket, then, with feverish excitement, in both the inside pockets. The pocketbook was not there. And, to his extreme amazement, all the other things which he was absolutely certain that he had left in the pockets of his jacket were gone, his cigarette case, his box of matches, his notebook. He was flabbergasted. His features became distorted. He spluttered incomprehensible words, while the most terrible thought took hold of his mind so forcibly as to become a reality: there was someone within the precincts of the old castle. There was someone within the precincts of the old castle. And this someone was now hiding near the ruins, in the ruins perhaps. And this someone had seen him. And this someone had witnessed the death of Arsène Lupin and the death of Florence Levasseur. And this someone, taking advantage of his heedlessness and knowing from his words that the papers existed, had searched his jacket and rifled the pockets. His eyes expressed the alarm of a man accustomed to work in the darkness unperceived, and who suddenly becomes aware that another's eyes have surprised him at his hateful task and that he is being watched in every movement for the first time in his life. Whence did that look come that troubled him as the daylight troubles a bird of the night? Was it an intruder hiding there by accident, or an enemy bent upon his destruction? Was it an accomplice of Arsène Lupin, a friend of Florence, one of the police? And was this adversary satisfied with his stolen booty, or was he preparing to attack him? The cripple dared not stir. He was there, exposed to assault, on open ground, with nothing to protect him against the blows that might come before he even knew where the adversary was. At last, however, the imminence of the danger gave him back some of his strength. Still motionless, he inspected his surroundings with an attention so keen that it seemed as if no detail could escape him. He would have sighted the most indistinct shape among the stones of the ruined pile, or in the bushes, or behind the tall laurel screen. Seeing nobody, he came along, supporting himself on his crutch. He walked without the least sound of his feet or of the crutch, which probably had a rubber shoe at the end of it. His raised right hand held a revolver. His finger was on the trigger. The least effort of his will, or even less than that, a spontaneous injunction of his instinct, was enough to put a bullet into the enemy. He turned to the left. On this side, between the extreme end of the laurels and the first fallen rocks, there was a little brick path which was more likely the top of a buried wall. The cripple followed this path, by which the enemy might have reached the shrub on which the jacket hung without leaving any traces. The last branches of the laurels were in his way, and he pushed them aside. There was a tangled mass of bushes. To avoid this, he skirted the foot of the mound, after which he took a few more steps, going round a huge rock. And then, suddenly, he started back and almost lost his balance, while his crutch fell to the ground and his revolver slipped from his hand. What he had seen, what he saw, was certainly the most terrifying sight that he could possibly have beheld. Opposite him, at 10 paces distance, with his hands in his pockets, his feet crossed, and one shoulder resting lightly against the rocky wall, stood not a man. It was not a man, and could not be a man, for this man, as the cripple knew, was dead. Had died the death from which there is no recovery. It was therefore a ghost, and this apparition from the tomb raised the cripple's terror to its highest pitch. He shivered, seized with a fresh attack of fever and weakness. His dilated pupils stared at the extraordinary phenomenon. His whole being, filled with demoniacal superstition and dread, crumpled up under the vision to which each second lent an added horror. Incapable of flight, incapable of defense, he dropped upon his knees. And he could not take his eyes from that dead man, whom hardly an hour before he had buried in the depths of a well, under a shroud of iron and granite. Arsène Lupin's ghost. A man you take aim at, you fire at, you kill. But a ghost. A thing which no longer exists and which nevertheless disposes of all the supernatural powers. What was the use of struggling against the infernal machinations of that which is no more? What was the use of picking up the fallen revolver and leveling it at the intangible spirit of Arsène Lupin? And he saw an incomprehensible thing occur. The ghost took its hands out of its pockets. One of them held a cigarette case. And the cripple recognized the same gunmetal case for which he had hunted in vain. There was therefore not a doubt left that the creature who had ransacked the jacket was the very same who now opened the case, picked out a cigarette and struck a match taken from a box which also belonged to the cripple. Oh miracle! A real flame came from the match. Oh incomparable marvel! Clouds of smoke rose from the cigarette, real smoke, of which the cripple at once knew the particular smell. He hid his head in his hands. He refused to see more. Whether ghost or optical illusion, an emanation from another world, or an image born of his remorse and proceeding from himself, it should torture his eyes no longer. But he heard the sound of a step approaching him, growing more and more distinct as it came closer. He felt a strange presence moving near him. An arm was stretched out. A hand fell on his shoulder. That hand clutched his flesh with an irresistible grip. And he heard words spoken by a voice which, beyond mistake, was the human and living voice of Arsène Lupin. "Why, my dear sir, what a state we're getting ourselves into. Of course, I understand that my sudden return seems an unusual and even an inconvenient proceeding, but still it does not do to be so uncontrollably impressed. Men have seen much more extraordinary things than that, such as Joshua staying the sun, and more sensational disasters, such as the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The wise man reduces events to their proper proportions and judges them, not by their action upon his own destiny, but by the way in which they influence the fortunes of the world. Now confess that your little mishap is purely individual and does not affect the equilibrium of the solar system. You know what Marcus Aurelius says, on page 84, of Charpentier's edition. The cripple had plucked up courage to raise his head. And the real state of things now became so obviously apparent that he could no longer get away from the undeniable fact: Arsène Lupin was not dead. Arsène Lupin, whom he had hurled into the bowels of the earth and crushed as surely as an insect is crushed with a hammer, Arsène Lupin was not dead. How to explain so astounding a mystery the cripple did not even stop to wonder. One thing alone mattered: Arsène Lupin was not dead. Arsène Lupin looked and spoke as a living man does. Arsène Lupin was not dead. He breathed, he smiled, he talked, he lived. And it was so certainly life that the scoundrel saw before him that, obeying a sudden impulse of his nature and of his hatred for life, he flattened himself to his full length, reached his revolver, seized it, and fired. He fired. But it was too late. Don Luis had caused the weapon to swerve with a kick of his boot. Another kick sent it flying out of the cripple's hand. The villain ground his teeth with fury and at once began hurriedly to fumble in his pockets. "Is this what you're looking for, sir?" asked Don Luis, holding up a hypodermic syringe filled with a yellow fluid. "Excuse me, but I was afraid lest you should prick yourself by mistake." "That would have been a fatal prick, would it not? And I should never have forgiven myself." The cripple was disarmed. He hesitated for a moment, surprised that the enemy did not attack him more violently, and sought to profit by the delay. His small, blinking eyes wandered around him, looking for something to throw. But an idea seemed to strike him and to restore his confidence little by little. And, in a new and really unexpected fit of delight, he indulged in one of his loudest chuckles. "And what about Florence?" he shouted. "Don't forget Florence. For I've got you there. I can miss you with my revolver and you can steal my poison. But I have another means of hitting you, right in the heart. You can't live without Florence, can you? Florence's death means your own sentence, doesn't it? If Florence is dead, you'll put the rope round your own neck, won't you, won't you, won't you?" "Yes. If Florence were to die, I could not survive her." "She is dead," cried the scoundrel, with a renewed burst of merriment, hopping about on his knees. "She's dead, quite dead. What am I saying? She's more than dead. A dead person retains the appearance of a live one for a time. But this is much better. There's no corpse here, Lupin, just a mess of flesh and bone. The whole scaffolding of rocks has come down on top of her. You can picture it, eh? What a sight. Come, quick, it's your turn to kick the bucket. Would you like a length of rope? Ha, ha, ha. It's enough to make one die with laughing. Didn't I say that you'd meet at the gates of hell? Quick, your sweetheart's waiting for you. Do you hesitate? Where's your old French politeness? You can't keep a lady waiting, you know. Hurry up, Lupin. Florence is dead." He said this with real enjoyment, as though the mere word of death appeared to him delicious. Don Luis had not moved a muscle. He simply nodded his head and said, "What a pity." The cripple seemed petrified. All his joyous contortions, all his triumphal pantomime, stopped short. He blurted out, "Eh? What did you say?" "I say," declared Don Luis, preserving his calm and courteous demeanor and refraining from echoing the cripple's familiarity, "I say, my dear sir, that you have done very wrong. I never met a finer nature nor one more worthy of esteem than that of Mlle Levasseur. The incomparable beauty of her face and figure, her youth, her charm, all these deserved a better treatment. It would indeed be a matter for regret if such a masterpiece of womankind had ceased to be." The cripple remained astounded. Don Luis's serene manner dismayed him. He said, in a blank voice, "I tell you, she has ceased to be. Haven't you seen the grotto? Florence no longer exists." "I refuse to believe it," said Don Luis quietly. "If that were so, everything would look different. The sky would be clouded, the birds would not be singing. And nature would wear her mourning garb. But the birds are singing, the sky is blue, everything is as it should be, the honest man is alive, and the rascal is crawling at his feet. How could Florence be dead?" A long silence followed upon these words. The two enemies, at 3 paces distance, looked into each other's eyes, Don Luis still as cool as ever, the cripple a prey to the maddest anguish. The monster understood. Obscure as the truth was, it shone forth before him with all the light of a blinding certainty. Florence also was alive. Humanly and physically speaking, the thing was not possible, but the resurrection of Don Luis was likewise an impossibility. And yet Don Luis was alive, with not a scratch on his face, with not a speck of dust on his clothes. The monster felt himself lost. The man who held him in the hollow of his implacable hand was one of those men whose power knows no bounds. He was one of those men who escape from the jaws of death and who triumphantly snatch from death those of whom they have taken charge. The monster retreated, dragging himself slowly backward on his knees along the little brick path. He retreated. He passed by the confused heap of stones that covered the place where the grotto had been, and did not turn his eyes in that direction, as if he were definitely convinced that Florence had come forth safe and sound from the appalling sepulchre. He retreated. Don Luis, who no longer had his eyes fixed on him, was busy unwinding a coil of rope which he had picked up, and seemed to pay no further attention to him. He retreated. And suddenly, after a glance at his enemy, he spun round, drew himself up on his slack legs with an effort, and started running toward the well. He was 20 paces from it. He covered 1/2, 3/4 of the distance. Already the mouth opened before him. He put out his arms, with the movement of a man about to dive, and shot forward. His rush was stopped. He rolled over on the ground, dragged back violently, with his arms fixed so firmly to his body that he was unable to stir. It was Don Luis, who had never wholly lost sight of him, who had made a slip knot to his rope and who had lassoed the cripple at the moment when he was going to fling himself down the abyss. The cripple struggled for a few moments. But the slip knot bit into his flesh. He ceased moving. Everything was over. Then Don Luis Perenna, holding the other end of the lasso, came up to him and bound him hand and foot with what remained of the rope. The operation was carefully performed. Don Luis repeated it time after time, using the coils of rope which the cripple had brought to the well and gagging him with a handkerchief. And, while applying himself to his work, he explained, with affected politeness. "You see, sir, people always come to grief through excessive self-confidence. They never imagine that their adversaries can have resources which they themselves do not possess. For instance, when you got me to fall into your trap, how could you have supposed, my dear sir, that a man like myself, a man like Arsène Lupin, hanging on the brim of a well, with his arms resting on the brim and his feet against the inner wall, would allow himself to drop down it like the first silly fool that comes along? Look here, you were 15 or 20 yards away, and do you think that I had not the strength to leap out nor the courage to face the bullets of your revolver, when it was a question of saving Florence Levasseur's life and my own? Why, my poor sir, the tiniest effort would have been enough, believe me. My reason for not making the effort was that I had something better to do, something infinitely better. I will tell you why, that is, if you care to know. Do you? Well, then, at the very first moment, my knees and feet, propped against the inner wall, had smashed in a thick layer of plaster which closed up an old excavation in the well, and this I at once perceived. It was a stroke of luck, wasn't it? And it changed the whole situation. My plan was settled at once. While I went on acting my little part of the gentleman about to tumble down an abyss, putting on the most scared face, the most staring eyes, the most hideous grin, I enlarged that excavation, taking care to throw the chunks of plaster in front of me in such a way that their fall made no noise. When the moment came, at the very second when my swooning features vanished before your eyes, I simply jumped into my retreat, thanks to a rather plucky little wriggle of the loins. I was saved, because the retreat was dug out on the side where you were moving and because, being dark itself, it cast no light. All that I now had to do was to wait. I listened quietly to your threatening speeches. I let the things you flung down the well go past me. And, when I thought you had gone back to Florence, I was preparing to leave my refuge, to return to the light of day, and to fall upon you from behind, when Don Luis turned the cripple over, as though he were a parcel which he was tying up with string, and continued. Have you ever been to Tancarville, the old feudal castle in Normandy, on the banks of the Seine? Haven't you? Well, you must know that, outside the ruins of the keep, there is an old well which, like many other wells of the period, possesses the peculiarity of having two openings, one at the top, facing the sky, and the other a little lower down, hollowed out sideways in the wall and leading to one of the rooms of the keep. At Tancarville this second opening is nowadays closed with a grating. Here it was walled up with a layer of small stones and plaster. And it was just the recollection of Tancarville that made me stay, all the more as there was no hurry, since you had had the kindness to inform me that Florence would not join me in the next world until 4 o'clock. I therefore inspected my refuge and soon realized that, as I had already felt by intuition, it was the foundation of a building which was now demolished and which had the garden laid out on its ruins. Well, I went on, groping my way and following the direction which, above ground, would have taken me to the grotto. My presentiments were not deceived. A gleam of daylight made its way at the top of a staircase of which I had struck the bottom step. I went up it and heard the sound of your voice. Don Luis turned the cripple over and was pretty rough about it. Then he resumed. I wish to impress upon you, my dear sir, that the upshot would have been exactly similar if I had attacked you directly and from the start in the open air. But, having said this, I confess that chance favored me to some purpose. It has often failed me, in the course of our struggle, but this time I had no cause to complain. I felt myself in such luck that I never doubted for a second that, having found the entrance to the subterranean passage, I should also find the way out. As a matter of fact, I had only to pull gently at the slight obstacle of a few stacked bricks which hid the opening in order to make my exit amid the remains of the castle keep. Guided by the sound of your voice, I slipped through the stones and thus reached the back of the grotto in which Florence lay. Amusing, wasn't it? You can imagine what fun it was to hear you make your little speeches. Answer me, yes or no, Florence. A movement of your head will decide your fate. If it's yes, I shall release you. If it's no, you die. Answer me, Florence. A sign of your head, is the answer yes or no? And the end, above all, was delicious, when you scrambled to the top of the grotto and started roaring from up there. It's you who have asked to die, Florence. You asked for it and you've got it. Just think what a joke it was. At that moment there was no one in the grotto. Not a soul. With one effort, I had drawn Florence toward me and put her under shelter. And all that you were able to crush with your avalanche of rocks was 1 or 2 spiders, perhaps, and a few flies dozing on the flagstones. The trick was done and the farce was nearly finished. Act first, Arsène Lupin saved. Act second, Florence Levasseur saved. Act third and last, the monster vanquished, absolutely and with a vengeance. Don Luis stood up and contemplated his work with a satisfied eye. You look like a sausage, my son. He cried, yielding at last to his sarcastic nature and his habit of treating his enemies familiarly. A regular sausage. A bit on the thin side, perhaps, a save-loy for poor people. But there, you don't much care what you look like, I suppose. Besides, you're rather like that at all times, and, in any case, you're just the thing for the little display of indoor gymnastics which I have in mind for you. You'll see, it's an idea of my own, a really original idea. Don't be impatient, we shan't be long. He took one of the guns which the cripple had brought to the well and tied to the middle of the gun the end of a 12 or 15 yards length of rope, fastening the other end to the cords with which the cripple was bound, just behind his back. He next took his captive round the body and held him over the well. Shut your eyes, if you feel at all giddy. And don't be frightened. I'll be very careful. Ready? He put the cripple down the yawning hole and next took hold of the rope which he had just fastened. Then, little by little, inch by inch, cautiously, so that it should not knock against the sides of the well, the bundle was let down at arm's length. When it reached a depth of 12 yards or so, the gun stopped its further descent and there it remained, slung in the dark and in the exact center of the narrow circumference. Don Luis set light to a number of pieces of paper, which went whirling down, shedding their sinister gleams upon the walls. Then, unable to resist the craving for a last speech, he leaned over, as the scoundrel had done, and grinned. I selected the place with care, so that you shouldn't catch cold. I'm bound to look after you, you see. I promised Florence that I wouldn't kill you, and I promised the French government to hand you over alive as soon as possible. Only, as I didn't know what to do with you until tomorrow morning, I've hung you up in the air. It's a pretty trick, isn't it? And you ought to appreciate it, for it's so like your own way of doing things. Just think, the gun is resting on its two ends, with hardly an inch to spare. So, if you start wriggling, or moving, or even breathing too hard, either the barrel or the butt end'll give way, and down you go. As for me, I've nothing to do with it. If you die, it'll be a pretty little case of suicide. All you've got to do, old chap, is to keep quiet. And the beauty of my little contrivance is that it will give you a foretaste of the few nights that will precede your last hour, when they cut off your head. From this moment forward you are alone with your conscience, face to face with what you perhaps call your soul, without anything to disturb your silent soliloquy. It's nice and thoughtful of me, isn't it? Well, I'll leave you. And remember, not a movement, not a sigh, not a wink, not a throb of the heart. And, above all, no larks. If you start larking, you're in the soup. Meditate, that's the best thing you can do. Meditate and wait. Goodbye, for the present. And Don Luis, satisfied with his homily, went off, muttering. That's all right. I won't go so far as Eugene Sue, who says that great criminals should have their eyes put out. But, all the same, a little corporal punishment, nicely seasoned with fear, is right and proper and good for the health and morals. Don Luis walked away and, taking the brick path round the ruins, turned down a little road, which ran along the outer wall to a clump of fir trees, where he had brought Florence for shelter. She was waiting for him, still aching from the horrible suffering which she had endured, but already in full possession of her pluck, mistress of herself. And apparently rid of all anxiety as to the issue of the fight between Don Luis and the cripple. It's finished, he said, simply. Tomorrow I will hand him over to the police. She shuddered. But she did not speak, and he observed her in silence. It was the first time that they were alone together since they had been separated by so many tragedies, and next hurled against each other like sworn enemies. Don Luis was so greatly excited that, in the end, he could utter only insignificant sentences, having no connection with the thoughts that came rushing through his mind. We shall find the motor car if we follow this wall and then strike off to the left. Do you think you can manage to walk so far? When we're in the car, we'll go to Alassa. There's a quiet hotel close to the chief square. You can wait there until things take a more favorable turn for you, and that won't be long, as the criminal is caught. Let's go, she said. He dared not offer to help her. For that matter, she stepped out firmly and her graceful body swung from her hips with the same even rhythm as usual. Don Luis once again felt all his old admiration and all his ardent love for her. And yet that had never seemed more remote than at this moment when he had saved her life by untold miracles of energy. She had not vouchsafed him a word of thanks nor yet one of those milder glances which reward an effort made. And she remained the same as on the first day, the mysterious creature whose secret soul he had never understood, and upon whom not even the storm of terrible events had cast the faintest light. What were her thoughts? What were her wishes? What aim was she pursuing? These were obscure problems which he could no longer hope to solve. Henceforth each of them must go his own way in life, and each of them could only remember the other with feelings of anger and spite. No, he said to himself, as she took her place in the limousine. No. The separation shall not take place like that. The words that have to be spoken between us shall be spoken, and, whether she wishes or not, I will tear the veil that hides her. The journey did not take long. At Alassa Don Luis entered Florence in the visitor's book under the first name that occurred to him and left her to herself. An hour later he came and knocked at her door. This time again he had not the courage at once to ask her the question which he had made up his mind to put to her. Besides, there were other points which he wished to clear up. "Florence," he said, "before I hand over that man, I should like to know what he was to you." "A friend, an unhappy friend, for whom I felt pity," she declared. "I find it difficult today to understand my compassion for such a monster. But, some years ago, when I first met him, I became attached to him because of his wretchedness, his physical weakness, and all the symptoms of death which he bore upon him even then. He had the opportunity of doing me a few services. And, though he led a hidden life, which worried me in certain respects, he gradually and without my knowing it acquired a considerable influence over me. I believed in his insight, in his will, in his absolute devotion. And, when the Mornington case started, it was he, as I now realize, who guided my actions and, later, those of Gaston Sauverand. It was he who compelled me to practice lying and deceit, persuading me that he was working for Marie Fauville's safety. It was he who inspired us with such suspicion of yourself and who taught us to be so silent, where he and his affairs were concerned, that Gaston Sauverand did not even dare mention him in his interview with you. I don't know how I can have been so blind. But it was so. Nothing opened my eyes. Nothing made me suspect for a moment that harmless, ailing creature, who spent half his life in hospitals or nursing homes, who underwent every possible sort of operation, and who, if he did sometimes speak to me of his love, must have known that he could not hope to. Florence did not finish her sentence. Her eyes had encountered Don Luis's eyes, and she received a deep impression that he was not listening to what she said. He was looking at her, and that was all. The words she uttered passed unheard. To Don Luis any explanation concerning the tragedy itself mattered nothing, so long as he was not enlightened on the one point that interested him, on Florence's private thoughts about himself, thoughts of aversion, of contempt. Outside that, anything that she could say was vain and tedious. He went up to her and, in a low voice, said, "Florence, you know what I feel for you, do you not?" She blushed, taken aback, as though the question was the very last that she expected to hear. Nevertheless, she did not lower her eyes, and she answered frankly. "Yes, I know. But, perhaps," he continued, more eagerly, "you do not know how deeply I feel it. Perhaps you do not know that my life has no other aim but you." "I know that also," she said. "Then, if you know it," he said, "I must conclude that it was just that which caused your hostility to me. From the beginning I tried to be your friend and I tried only to defend you. And yet from the beginning I felt that for you I was the object of an aversion that was both instinctive and deliberate. Never did I see in your eyes anything but coldness, dislike, contempt, and even repulsion. At moments of danger, when your life or your liberty was at stake, you risked committing any imprudence rather than accept my assistance. I was the enemy, the man to be distrusted, the man capable of every infamy, the man to be avoided, and to be thought of only with a sort of dread. Isn't that hatred? Is there anything but hatred to explain such an attitude? Florence did not answer at once. She seemed to be putting off the moment at which to speak the words that rose to her lips. Her face, thin and drawn with weariness and pain, was gentler than usual. Yes, she said, there are other things than hatred to explain that attitude. Don Luis was dumbfounded. He did not quite understand the meaning of the reply. But Florence's tone of voice disconcerted him beyond measure, and he also saw that Florence's eyes no longer wore their usual scornful expression and that they were filled with smiling charm. And it was the first time that Florence had smiled in his presence. "Speak, speak, I entreat you," he stammered. "I mean to say that there is another feeling which explains coldness, mistrust, fear, and hostility. It is not always those whom we detest that we avoid with the greatest fear. And, if we avoid them, it is often because we are afraid of ourselves, because we are ashamed, because we rebel and want to resist and want to forget and cannot." She stopped. And, when he wildly stretched out his arms to her, as if beseeching her to say more and still more, she nodded her head, thus telling him that she need not go on speaking for him to read to the very bottom of her soul and discover the secret of love which she kept hidden there. Don Luis staggered on his feet. He was intoxicated with happiness, almost suffered physical pain from that unexpected happiness. After the horrible minutes through which he had passed amid the impressive surroundings of the old castle, it appeared to him madness to admit that such extraordinary bliss could suddenly blossom forth in the commonplace setting of that room at a hotel. He could have longed for space around him, forest, mountains, moonlight, a radiant sunset, all the beauty and all the poetry of the earth. With one rush, he had reached the very acme of happiness. Florence's very life came before him, from the instant of their meeting to the tragic moment when the cripple, bending over her and seeing her eyes filled with tears, had shouted, "She's crying! She's crying! What madness! But I know your secret, Florence. And you're crying. Florence, Florence, you yourself want to die." It was a secret of love, a passionate impulse which, from the first day, had driven her all trembling toward Don Luis. Then it had bewildered her, filled her with fear, appeared to her as a betrayal of Marie and Sovereign and, by turns urging her toward and drawing her away from the man whom she loved and whom she admired for his heroism and loyalty. Rending her with remorse and overwhelming her as though it were a crime, had ended by delivering her, feeble and disabled, to the diabolical influence of the villain who coveted her. Don Luis did not know what to do, did not know in what words to express his rapture. His lips trembled. His eyes filled with tears. His nature prompted him to take her in his arms, to kiss her as a child kisses, full on the lips, with a full heart. But a feeling of intense respect paralyzed his yearning. And, overcome with emotion, he fell at Florence's feet, stammering words of love and adoration. Chapter 21. Lupins. Next morning, a little before 8 o'clock, Vaillanglais was talking in his own flat to the prefect of police, and asked, "So you think as I do, my dear prefect? He'll come?" "I haven't the least doubt of it, Monsieur le Président. And he will come with the same punctuality that has been shown throughout this business. He will come, for pride's sake, at the last stroke of 8. You think so?" "Monsieur le Président, I have been studying the man for months. As things now stand, with Florence Levasseur's life in the balance, if he has not smashed the villain whom he is hunting down, if he does not bring him back bound hand and foot, it will mean that Florence Levasseur is dead and that he, Arsène Lupin, is dead." "Whereas Lupin is immortal," said Vaillanglais, laughing. "You're right. Besides, I agree with you entirely. No one would be more astonished than I if our good friend was not here to the minute. You say you were rung up from angers yesterday?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président. My men had just seen Don Luis Perenna. He had gone in front of them, in an aeroplane. After that, they telephoned to me again from Le Mans, where they had been searching a deserted coach house. You may be sure that the search had already been made by Lupin, and that we shall know the results. Listen, 8 o'clock. At the same moment they heard the throbbing of a motor car. It stopped outside the house. And the bell rang almost immediately after. Orders had been given beforehand. The door opened and Don Luis Perenna was shown in. To Valenglay and the prefect of police his arrival was certainly not unexpected, for they had just been saying that they would have been surprised if he had not come. Nevertheless, their attitude showed that astonishment which we all experience in the face of events that seem to pass the bounds of human possibility. "Well," cried the Prime Minister eagerly. "It's done, Monsieur le Président." "Have you collared the scoundrel?" "Yes." "By Jove," said Valenglay. "You're a fine fellow." And he went on to ask. "An ogre, of course. An evil, undaunted brute?" "No, Monsieur le Président, a cripple, a degenerate, responsible for his actions, certainly, but a man in whom the doctors will find every form of wasting illness, disease of the spinal cord, tuberculosis, and all the rest of it." "And is that the man whom Florence Levasseur loved?" "Monsieur le Président." Don Luis violently protested. "Florence never loved that wretch. She felt sorry for him, as anyone would for a fellow creature doomed to an early death. And it was out of pity that she allowed him to hope that she might marry him later, at some time in the vague future." "Are you sure of that?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président, of that and of a good deal more besides, for I have the proofs in my hands." Without further preamble, he continued, "Monsieur le Président, now that the man is caught, it will be easy for the police to find out every detail of his life. But meanwhile I can sum up that monstrous life for you, looking only at the criminal side of it, and passing briefly over 3 murders which have nothing to do with the story of the Mornington case. Jean Vernock was born at Alassa and brought up at old M. Langernault's expense. He got to know the de Desislemer couple, robbed them of their money and, before they had time to lodge a complaint against the unknown thief, took them to a barn in the village of Demigny, where, in their despair, stupefied and besotted with drugs, they hanged themselves. This barn stood in a property called the Old Castle, belonging to M. Langernault, Jean Vernock's protector, who was ill at the time. After his recovery, as he was cleaning his gun, he received a full charge of shot in the abdomen. The gun had been loaded without the old fellow's knowledge. By whom? By Jean Vernock, who had also emptied his patron's cash box the night before. In Paris, where he went to enjoy the little fortune which he had thus amassed. Jean Vernock bought from some rogue of his acquaintance papers containing evidence of Florence Levasseur's birth and of her right to all the inheritance of the Roussel family and Victor Sauverand. Papers which the friend in question had purloined from the old nurse who brought Florence over from America. By hunting around, Jean Vernock ended by discovering first a photograph of Florence and then Florence herself. He made himself useful to her and pretended to be devoted to her, giving up his whole life to her service. At that time he did not yet know what profit he could derive from the papers stolen from the girl or from his relations with her. Suddenly everything became different. An indiscreet word let fall by a solicitor's clerk told him of a will in Maître Lepertuis's drawer which would be interesting to look at. He obtained a sight of it by bribing the clerk, who has since disappeared, with a 1,000-franc note. The will, as it happened, was Cosmo Mornington's, and in it Cosmo Mornington bequeathed his immense wealth to the heirs of the Roussel sisters and of Victor Sauverand. Jean Vernock saw his chance. 100 million francs. To get hold of that sum, to obtain riches, luxury, power, and the means of buying health and strength from the world's great healers, all that he had to do was first to put away the different persons who stood between the inheritance and Florence. And then, when all the obstacles were overcome, to make Florence his wife. Jean Vernock went to work. He had found among the papers of Hippolyte Fauville's old friend Langernault particulars relating to the Roussel family and to the discord that reigned in the Fauville household. 5 persons, all told, were in his way. First, of course, Cosmo Mornington, next, in the order of their claims, Hippolyte Fauville, his son Edmond, his wife Marie, and his cousin Gaston Sauverand. With Cosmo Mornington, the thing was easy enough. Introducing himself to the American as a doctor, Jean Vernock put poison into one of the phials which Mornington used for his hypodermic injections. But in the case of Hippolyte Fauville, whose goodwill he had secured through his acquaintance with old Langernault, and over whose mind he soon obtained an extraordinary influence, he had a greater difficulty to contend with. Knowing on the one hand that the engineer hated his wife and on the other that he was stricken with a fatal disease, he took occasion, after the consultation with the specialist in London, to suggest to Fauville's terrified brain the incredible plan of suicide of which you were subsequently able to trace the Machiavellian execution. In this way and with a single effort, anonymously, so to speak, and without appearing in the business, without Fauville's even suspecting the action brought to bear upon him, Jean Vernock procured the deaths of Fauville and his son, and got rid of Marie and Sauverand by the devilish expedient of causing the charge of murder, of which no one could accuse him, to fall upon them. The plan succeeded. There was only one hitch at the present time, the intervention of Inspector Verret. Inspector Verret died. And there was only one danger in the future, the intervention of myself, Don Luis Perenna, whose conduct Vernock was bound to foresee, as I was the residuary legatee by the terms of Cosmo Mornington's will. This danger Vernock tried to avert first by giving me the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon to live in and Florence Levasseur as a secretary, and next by making 4 attempts to have me assassinated by Gaston Sauverand. He therefore held all the threads of the tragedy in his hands. Able to come and go as he pleased in my house, enforcing himself upon Florence and later upon Gaston Sauverand by the strength of his will and the cunning of his character, he was within sight of the goal. When my efforts succeeded in proving the innocence of Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, he did not hesitate. Marie Fauville died, Gaston Sauverand died. So everything was going well for him. The police pursued me. The police pursued Florence. No one suspected him. And the date fixed for the payment of the inheritance was at hand. This was 2 days ago. At that time, Jean Vernock was in the midst of the fray. He was ill and had obtained admission to the nursing home in the Avenue de Tournis. From there he conducted his operations, thanks to his influence over Florence Levasseur and to the letters addressed to the Mother Superior from Versailles. Acting under the Superior's orders and ignorant of the meaning of the step which she was taking, Florence went to the meeting at the prefect's office, and herself brought the documents relating to her. Meanwhile, Jean Vernock left the private hospital and took refuge near the Isle St. Louis, where he awaited the result of an enterprise which, at the worst, might tell against Florence, but which did not seem able to compromise him in any case. You know the rest, Monsieur le Président, said Don Luis, concluding his statement. Florence, staggered by the sudden revelation of the part which she had unconsciously taken in the matter, and especially by the terrible part played by Jean Vernock, ran away from the nursing home where the prefect had brought her at my request. She had but one thought, to see Jean Vernock, demand an explanation of him, and hear what he had to say in his defense. That same evening he carried her away by motor, on the pretense of giving her proofs of his innocence. That is all, Monsieur le Président. Vaillanglais had listened with growing interest to this gruesome story of the most malevolent genius conceivable to the mind of man. And he heard it perhaps without too great disgust, because of the light which it threw by contrast upon the bright, easy, happy, and spontaneous genius of the man who had fought for the good cause. And you found them? He asked. At 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Monsieur le Président. It was time. I might even say that it was too late, for Jean Vernock began by sending me to the bottom of a well, and by crushing Florence under a block of stone. Oh, so you're dead, are you? Yes, Monsieur le Président. But why did that villain want to do away with Florence Levasseur? Her death destroyed his indispensable scheme of matrimony. It takes 2 to get married, Monsieur le Président, and Florence refused. Well. Some time ago Jean Vernock wrote a letter leaving all that he possessed to Florence Levasseur. Florence, moved by pity for him, and not realizing the importance of what she was doing, wrote a similar letter leaving her property to him. This letter constitutes a genuine and indisputable will in favor of Jean Vernock. As Florence was Cosmo Mornington's legal and settled heiress by the mere fact of her presence at yesterday's meeting with the documents proving her descent from the Roussel family. Her death caused her rights to pass to her own legal and settled heir. Jean Vernock would have come into the money without the possibility of any litigation. And, as you would have been obliged to discharge him after his arrest, for lack of evidence against him, he would have led a quiet life, with 14 murders on his conscience. I have added them up, but with 100 million francs in his pocket. To a monster of his stamp, the one made up for the other. But do you possess all the proofs? Asked Vaillanglay eagerly. Here they are, said Perenna, producing the pocketbook which he had taken out of the cripple's jacket. Here are letters and documents which the villain preserved, owing to a mental aberration common to all great criminals. Here, by good luck, is his correspondence with Hippolyte Fauville. Here is the original of the prospectus from which I learned that the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon was for sale. Here is a memorandum of Jean Vernock's journeys to Alassa to intercept Fauville's letters to old Langernault. Here is another memorandum showing that Inspector Verret overheard a conversation between Fauville and his accomplice, that he shadowed Vernock and robbed him of Florence Levasseur's photograph, and that Vernock sent Fauville in pursuit of him. Here is a third memorandum, which is just a copy of the two found in the 8th volume of Shakespeare and which proves that Jean Vernock, to whom that set of Shakespeare belonged, knew all about Fauville's machination. Here are his correspondence with Caceres, the Peruvian attaché, and the letters denouncing myself and Sergeant Maizerou, which he intended to send to the press. Here. But need I say more, Monsieur le Président? You have the complete evidence in your hands. The magistrates will find that all the accusations which I made yesterday, before the prefect of police, were strictly true. And he, cried Vaillanglay. The criminal. Where is he? Outside, in a motor car, in his motor car, rather. Have you told my men? Asked M. Desmalions anxiously. Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. Besides, the fellow is carefully tied up. Don't be alarmed. He won't escape. Well, you've foreseen every contingency, said Vaillanglay, and the business seems to me to be finished. But there's one problem that remains unexplained, the one perhaps that interested the public most. I mean the marks of the teeth in the apple, the teeth of the tiger, as they have been called, which were certainly Madame Fauville's teeth, innocent though she was. Monsieur le Préfet declares that you have solved this problem. Yes, Monsieur le Président, and Jean Vernock's papers prove that I was right. Besides, the problem is quite simple. The apple was marked with Madame Fauville's teeth, but Madame Fauville never bit the apple. Come, come. Monsieur le Président, Hippolyte Fauville very nearly said as much when he mentioned this mystery in his posthumous confession. Hippolyte Fauville was a madman. Yes, but a lucid madman and capable of reasoning with the most appalling logic. Some years ago, at Palermo, Madame Fauville had a very bad fall, hitting her mouth against the marble top of a table, with the result that a number of her teeth, in both the upper and the lower jaw, were loosened. To repair the damage and to make the gold plate intended to strengthen the teeth, a plate which Madame Fauville wore for several months, the dentist, as usual, took an impression of her mouth. M. Fauville happened to have kept the mold. And he used it to print the marks of his wife's teeth in the cake of chocolate shortly before his death and in the apple on the night of his death. When this was done, he put the mold with the other things which the explosion was meant to, and did, destroy. Don Luis's explanation was followed by a silence. The thing was so simple that the Prime Minister was quite astonished. The whole tragedy, the whole charge. Everything that had caused Marie's despair and death and the death of Gaston Sauverand, all this rested on an infinitely small detail which had occurred to none of the millions and millions of people who had interested themselves so enthusiastically in the mystery of the teeth of the tiger. The teeth of the tiger. Everybody had clung stubbornly to an apparently invincible argument. As the marks on the apple and the print of Madame Fauville's teeth were identical, and as no two persons in the world were able, in theory or practice, to produce the same print with their teeth, Madame Fauville must needs be guilty. Nay, more, the argument seemed so absolute that, from the day on which Madame Fauville's innocence became known, the problem had remained unsolved, while no one seemed capable of conceiving the one paltry idea, that it was possible to obtain the print of a tooth in another way than by a live bite of that same tooth. "It's like the egg of Columbus," said Vaillanglay, laughing. "It had to be thought of." "You are right, Monsieur le Président. People don't think of those things. Here is another instance. May I remind you that during the period when Arsène Lupin was known at the same time as M. Lenormand and as Prince Paul Cernine, no one noticed that the name Paul Cernine was merely an anagram of Arsène Lupin. Well, it's just the same today. Luis Perenna also is an anagram of Arsène Lupin. The two names are composed of the same 11 letters, neither more nor less. And yet, although it was the second time, nobody thought of making that little comparison. The egg of Columbus again. It had to be thought of. Vaillanglay was a little surprised at the revelation. It seemed as if that devil of a man had sworn to puzzle him up to the last moment and to bewilder him by the most unexpected sensational news. And how well this last detail depicted the fellow, a queer mixture of dignity and impudence, of mischief and simplicity, of smiling chaff and disconcerting charm, a sort of hero who, while conquering kingdoms by most incredible adventures, amused himself by mixing up the letters on his name so as to catch the public napping. The interview was nearly at an end. Vaillanglay said to Perenna, "Monsieur, you have done wonders in this business and ended by keeping your word and handing over the criminal. I also will keep my word. You are free." "I thank you, Monsieur le Président. But what about Sergeant Maizerou? He will be released this morning. Monsieur le Préfet de Police has arranged matters so that the public do not know of the arrest of either of you. You are Don Luis Perenna. There is no reason why you should not remain Don Luis Perenna. And Florence Levasseur, Monsieur le Président? Let her go before the examining magistrate of her own accord. He is bound to discharge her. Once free and acquitted of any charge or even suspicion, she will certainly be recognized as Cosmo Mornington's legal heiress and will receive the 100 millions. She will not keep it, Monsieur le Président." "How do you mean?" "Florence Levasseur doesn't want the money. It has been the cause of unspeakably awful crimes. She hates the very thought of it." "What then?" "Cosmo Mornington's 100 millions will be wholly devoted to making roads and building schools in the south of Morocco and the northern Congo." "In the Mauritanian Empire which you are giving us?" said Vaillanglay, laughing. "By Jove, it's a fine work and I second it with all my heart. An empire and an imperial budget to keep it up with. Upon my word, Don Luis has behaved well to his country, and has handsomely paid the debts of Arsène Lupin." A month later Don Luis Perenna and Maizerou embarked in the yacht which had brought Don Luis to France. Florence was with them. Before sailing they heard of the death of Jean Vernac, who had managed to poison himself in spite of all the precautions taken to prevent him. On his arrival in Africa, Don Luis Perenna, Sultan of Mauritania, found his old associates and accredited Maizerou to them and to his grand dignitaries. He organized the government to follow on his abdication and precede the annexation of the new empire by France, and he had several secret interviews on the Moorish border with General Lodi, commanding the French troops. Interviews in the course of which they thought out all the measures to be executed in succession so as to lend to the conquest of Morocco an appearance of facility which would otherwise be difficult to explain. The future was now assured. Soon the thin screen of rebellious tribes standing between the French and the pacified districts would fall to pieces, revealing an orderly empire, provided with a regular constitution, with good roads, schools, and courts of law. A flourishing empire in full working order. Then, when his task was done, Don Luis abdicated. He has now been back for over 2 years. Every one remembers the stir caused by his marriage with Florence Levasseur. The controversy was renewed. And many of the newspapers clamored for Arsène Lupin's arrest. But what could the authorities do? Although nobody doubted who he really was, although the name of Arsène Lupin and the name of Don Luis Perenna consisted of the same letters, and people ended by remarking the coincidence, legally speaking. Arsène Lupin was dead and Don Luis Perenna was alive. And there was no possibility of bringing Arsène Lupin back to life or of killing Don Luis Perenna. He is today living in the village of Saint-Maclou, among those charming valleys which run down to the Oise. Who does not know his modest little pink-washed house, with its green shutters and its garden filled with bright flowers? People make up parties to go there from Paris on Sundays, in the hope of catching a sight, through the elder hedges, of the man who was Arsène Lupin, or of meeting him in the village square. He is there, with his hair just touched with grey, his still youthful features, and a young man's bearing. And Florence is there, too, with her pretty figure and the halo of fair hair around her happy face, unclouded by even the shadow of an unpleasant recollection. Very often visitors come and knock at the little wooden gate. They are unfortunate people imploring the master's aid, victims of oppression, weaklings who have gone under in the struggle, reckless persons who have been ruined by their passions. For all these Don Luis is full of pity. He gives them his full attention, the help of his far-seeing advice, his experience, his strength, and even his time, disappearing for days and weeks to fight the good fight once more. And sometimes also it is an emissary from the prefect's office or some subordinate of the police who comes to submit a complex case to his judgment. Here again Don Luis applies the whole of his wonderful mind to the business. In addition to this, in addition to his old books on ethics and philosophy, to which he has returned with such pleasure, he cultivates his garden. He dotes on his flowers. He is proud of them. He takes prizes at the shows. And the success is still remembered of the treble carnation, streaked red and yellow, which he exhibited as the Arsène carnation. But he works hardest at certain large flowers that blossom in summer. During July and the first half of August they fill 2/3 of his lawn and all the borders of his kitchen garden. Beautiful, decorative plants, standing erect like flagstaffs, they proudly raise their spiky heads of all colors, blue, violet, mauve, pink, white. They are lupins and include every variety, Cruikshank's lupin, the two-colored lupin, the scented lupin, and the last to appear, Lupin's lupin. They are all there, resplendent, in serried ranks like an army of soldiers, each striving to outstrip the others and to hold up the thickest and gaudiest spike to the sun. They are all there. And, at the entrance to the walk that leads to their motley beds, is a streamer with this device, taken from an exquisite sonnet of José María de Heredia. And in my kitchen garden lupins grow. You will say that this is a confession. But why not? In the evening, when a few privileged neighbors meet at his house, the justice of the peace, the notary, Major Comte d'Estrignac, who has also gone to live at Saint-Maclou, Don Luis is not afraid to speak of Arsène Lupin. I used to see a great deal of him, he says. He was not a bad man. I will not go so far as to compare him with the 7 sages, or even to hold him up as an example to future generations, but still we must judge him with a certain indulgence. He did a vast amount of good and a moderate amount of harm. Those who suffered through him deserved what they got, and fate would have punished them sooner or later if he had not forestalled her. Between a Lupin who selected his victims among the ruck of wicked rich men and some big company promoter who deliberately ruins numbers of poor people, would you hesitate for a moment? Does not Lupin come out best? And, on the other hand, what a host of good actions. What countless proofs of disinterested generosity. A burglar? I admit it. A swindler? I don't deny it. He was all that. But he was something more than that. And, while he amused the gallery with his skill and ingenuity, he roused the general enthusiasm in other ways. People laughed at his practical jokes, but they loved his pluck, his courage, his adventurous spirit, his contempt for danger, his shrewd insight, his unfailing good humor. His reckless energy, all qualities that stood out at a period when the most active virtues of our race had reached their zenith, the period of the motor car and the aeroplane. One day, he said, as a joke, I should like my epitaph to read, here lies Arsène Lupin, adventurer. That was quite correct. He was a master of adventure. And, if the spirit of adventure led him too often to put his hand in other people's pockets, it also led him to battlefields where it gives those who are worthy opportunity to fight and win titles of distinction which are not within reach of all. It was there that he gained his. It is there that you should see him at work, spending his strength braving death, and defying destiny. And it is because of this that you must forgive him, even if he did sometimes get the better of a commissary of police or steal the watch of an examining magistrate. Let us show some indulgence to our professors of energy. And, nodding his head, Don Luis concludes. Then, you see, he had another virtue which is not to be despised. It is a virtue for which we should be grateful to him in these grey days of ours: he knew how to smile. The end.